Well, it's an honor to share with you this subject, and yet it's a great regret that I have that in America, the home of freedom and liberty, we have to be talking about something like the silencing of Christianity in our country. We all know that if one religious faith is in danger, all are. And when we lose our religious freedom, we lose everything else. And that's why this is so important. And that's why this subject is such a passionate subject for me. It's not just because I'm a Christian. It's not just because I'm a pastor and a preacher. It's because freedom of expression, especially religious expression, is the bedrock of why America came to be. The ability to believe what you feel is right and to be able to freely, without fear of intimidation from government, say it. That's what America's about. Unfortunately, today, out of all the religious faiths that it's okay to practice openly, there is one that season has been pronounced on, and that's Christianity. It's interesting that you can call yourself just about anything else, and that's okay. But if you call yourself a Christian, then you need to keep it to yourself. So let's talk about what's going on in our country and why this is such a problem. In John chapter 15, verses 18 through 20, Jesus warned His disciples and subsequent followers over the centuries. He said, "If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet, because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you." Now that was a prophecy that Jesus gave about His message. Unfortunately, that prophecy is coming true right here in America. Not long ago, Ann Coulter wrote a book entitled Godless. And in this book she says, if a Martian landed in America and set out to determine the nation's official state religion, he would have to conclude it is liberalism, while Christianity and Judaism are prohibited by law. Now, even though we aren't quite there, I think she has a point. And when you look at the history of our country, when you look at the founding of our country and our founders and the founding principles, it's easy to see that the majority claimed some type of Christian faith. And then second to that were those who claimed Jewish beliefs. John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, he said, "The greatest glory of the American Revolution was that it bound together in one indissoluble bond the principles of Christianity and the principles of civil government." Notice what he says we're bound together in America. Two sets of principles. Principles of Christianity, the principles of civil government. Preachers during that period of time preached boldly about how faith and civil liberty are connected, how religious liberty and civil liberty stand together. Here's Jonathan Mayhew, the one who made the phrase taxation without representation famous, from his pulpit. He preached election sermons. Listen to what he said. "We know that our civil and religious rights are linked together in one indissoluble bond." Kind of sound like the same thing? Right. "We neither have nor seek to have any interest separate from that of our country, nor can we advise a desertion of its cause. Religion and liberty must flourish or fall together in America. We pray that both may be perpetual." So notice they saw a direct connection to civil and religious liberty. Now here's a newspaper circular that printed the farewell address of George Washington. The farewell address, by the way, that is no longer taught in our public schools because administrators said it sounds too much like a sermon. They didn't give these speeches, they printed them, their farewell speeches. Listen to just a little portion of this. He said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political, notice, political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion." So you see, Washington understood, Adams understood, his son, John Quincy Adams, understood, and we'll see later on this afternoon, a whole host of others understood the link. Now, in numerous times throughout our nation's history, our country has been sued by some who say, well, this isn't a Christian nation, it never was, and you ought to quit calling it that. And there have been many times when our courts and even Congress has had to restate the founding principles. And here's one of those instances. In 1854, the House Judiciary Committee, along with the Senate Judiciary Committee, did a thorough study of the history of our country, and this is a portion of their finding. They said, had the Founding Fathers during the Revolution a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and its amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged. Notice that word, encouraged. In this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. Now, that's just one official statement from our country over the years, where over and over and over, historians and others have had to research the founding principles that have made this nation so great. Now, obviously, we've come a far piece from 1776 or even from 1854, because today we see an all-out blitzkrieg against Christianity. Now, the reasons should be fairly obvious. They understand that just like in the Revolution, as we will see this afternoon, Christianity is pretty much the kingpin. If you can eradicate Christianity and public expression of Christianity from the public square, then all the other religious faiths and expressions will be gone. And so I think it's understandable that they have really placed in the crosshairs Christianity, and in particular, the Bible and public expression. Now, how is the government trying to silence us, and how is our culture using our courts, our laws, even our Congress, to put us out of business? Well, number one, they do it through government intimidation. I'm convinced this is why so many pastors are silent. They are just so afraid. Now, most of you are well aware that in 2009, the Homeland Defense Department, headed up by Napolitano, came out with an official report. Now, even though there was such an outcry that this report was withdrawn, what this report does is it tells us what they're thinking inside the Beltway. What these people who believe that Christianity is the number one problem in America, it tells us what these people are thinking. Now, in this report, they named really problematic groups. They named groups like white supremacists. They named violent anti-government groups. They named people who are anti-free trade. They named right-wing extremists. They named the militia movement, as if the militia is some type of terrible word, even though it's found in our Second Amendment. They named returning veterans as a major threat. And then they also cited Christian identity organizations. Now, they didn't bother to give finer details to these groups. These are just names taken right out of that report, and they claimed that these were the greatest threats to America. Notice names that are strangely missing. Do any of you see Al-Qaeda up there? Do any of you see jihadists up there? No. And who are the ones who've attacked America over and over, and who have said as their expressed desire to destroy America and to wipe Israel off the face of the map? Okay, so it's kind of interesting that it was primarily Christian-based groups that were their targets. Now, they named a number of problems that these groups have. For instance, they said these groups are antagonistic toward the new presidential administration and its perceived stance on a range of issues: immigration and citizenship, the expansion of social programs to minorities, and restrictions on firearms ownership and use. Now, notice these are perceived. We're just making this up. There is no threat. We're just perceiving these things. They said another problem with these groups is they're dedicated to single issues like opposition to abortion or immigration, taken right out of the report. They said another problem is that these people tend to reject federal authority in favor of state or local authority. Well, yeah, kind of like our founders. Exactly. They said another problem is these people are anti-immigration. Well, most of us are not anti-immigration, although I do believe there ought to be some careful records kept, and we don't need to have massive immigration. We need to be careful. We don't need to just open the borders and just have massive flow of immigration. We need to have controlled immigration. But they said they're anti-immigration, and they are strident pro-enforcement of immigration laws. Well, imagine that. That's just terrible that we would want our government to enforce the law. And then they said these people perceive an infringement on their civil liberties. What do you mean we perceive an infringement? And then last, they said a real big problem here is they believe in conspiracy theories and end-time prophecies. Now you realize that places a lot of evangelical pastors in this group right here. If you preach through the book of the Revelation and you talk about end-time prophecy, then according to our government, you're a problem. Now, of course, they remove the report, but you understand this is what they're thinking. Here's another way that they come at us, through hate crime legislation. You know that in 1998 in Wyoming, Matthew Shepard was brutally murdered. We all know that that's a crime. Doesn't matter how hateful the people were, they murdered him. So I figure that's a crime. We don't need to make it any more severe. Murder is the worst crime, and so we don't need to have hate crime designation. But they took him and they used him as a poster child, as tragic as his death was, and they expanded the National Defense Authorization Act, which was a way they could just get it through, and they wrote the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act, passed it 2009 on October 22nd. Of course, President Obama wasted no time signing it 6 days later, and it is now law. Now, even though that is not being used presently, everywhere where these types of laws have been written, they're used for one purpose and one purpose only: to stop any kind of religious thought that the establishment disagrees with. Now, understand that this measure expands all the laws that have existed before and actually investigate things such as crimes that are motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. This is the first federal law to extend legal protections to transgender persons as a particular group. So if you kill a preacher, well, that's not hateful. But if you kill a transvestite, now that was hateful and you shouldn't have been so hateful. Do you realize what's going on here? Gives federal authorities greater ability to engage in hate crimes investigations that local authorities choose not to pursue. And it requires the FBI to keep special statistics on hate crimes. Now, why do you need the word hate in front of crime? How about just crimes? You understand the purpose here is to intimidate and to control. Now, there have been some who've spoken out on it. Senator Pat Toomey said, "I think it's a bad idea for government to legislate on the basis of what they think." Notice he says what they think people are thinking, or what's in a person's mind or heart when they create a crime. Crime should be prosecuted for what's actually done. What a novel idea. Michelle Bachmann says, "I feel that this hate crime legislation could be considered the very definition of tyranny." So you have the hate crimes legislation. You have judicial tyranny. Many of you are probably familiar with the Swedish pastor A.K. Green because he preached that the Bible teaches homosexuality is a law. He was fined and sentenced to a month in jail for showing disrespect to homosexuals. Now, he made it very clear in his message that he didn't hate homosexuals. He was simply preaching his beliefs based upon Scripture. Subsequent to his arrest and fining, he eventually was able to exonerate himself. But that's what's been going on around the world for years now. Here's Lars Ohly, the leader of the Swedish Left Party, and notice what he's doing. He's working to force pastors in Sweden to perform homosexual weddings or face state punishment. Now, that's what's happening in Sweden. Now, Ohly goes on to say, "We don't think that someone should be allowed to refuse to wed same-sex couples. We have a proposal which we don't plan on walking away from." Now you say, well, of course, that's Sweden. That could never happen in America, right? Well, is it going to happen in America? Wrong. It's already happening in America. In August of 2008, California's highest court decided that Christian doctors, notice, Christian doctors may not refuse to perform artificial insemination for homosexual patients. So already, these kinds of things are going on right here in America. The attorney for those doctors, Brad Dacus of the Pacific Justice Institute, said, this is not about denying people services. This is instead about the thought police attempting to censor Christian beliefs and Christian perspectives that don't agree with homosexuality. We're talking about individuals being able to force doctors or other professionals to violate their faith in order to keep their job. So friends, it's already come to America. It's not a matter of if it's here, it's to what degree it is already here. Now, of course, no one is in favor of discrimination. I don't believe that folks ought to attack any one particular group, but at the same time, I do not believe that people against their own consciences should be forced to participate in something they believe is wrong. And I can tell you, eventually their goal is to force American pastors to perform homosexual weddings. Well, I can tell you, a good friend of mine, Paul Blair, and myself are two preachers in Oklahoma that will go to jail before we perform homosexual weddings. We simply believe it's unbiblical. We don't have any hate for homosexuals. We simply believe that the Bible teaches that among many other things, is a sin. The New Mexico couple, you've probably heard their story, John and Elaine Huguenin. They are photographers. And in New Mexico, the Human Rights Commission ordered them to pay a $6,600 fine for declining to photograph a commitment ceremony between two lesbians. Right there in New Mexico. A California student, not all that long ago, in November of 2008, Ryan Dozier, he is a student of the Yuba Community College in Yuba, California, was cited by campus police for sharing his faith and handing out tracts on campus. The officer told them that if he continued to do so without a permit, you need a permit to share your faith in California. If you continue to do this, he said, without a permit, that he would possibly be expelled or arrested. Just 3 weeks later, he received a certified letter from the president of the college stating his actions were the subject of a campus crime report and that he could face expulsion if he shared his faith on campus again. That's right there in California. You see, it is already here in America. But it's not just hate crimes legislation, government intimidation, judicial tyranny, workplace censorship. Over and over and over now, you're beginning to hear story after story about people who are being persecuted for their faith in the workplace. Here's a good example. This is John Cash from Virginia. He was a meteorologist with WAVY television in Virginia Beach. Cash was fired because of his after-hours. Now, I want you to notice that. After-hours Christian ministry. He had been an employee of that television station for 21 years, and he traveled as an evangelist preaching at area churches after hours. Listen to what his supervisor had to say. Doug Davis, his general manager, said, going into full-time ministry was bad for business. And so they fired Cash based upon his after-hours activities. Now, some of these cases that I'm telling you about have since been adjudicated, and in some instances, the courts have actually come down in favor of individual rights and liberty. But the very fact that you have to go to court in America to defend your liberty is a major issue. Now here's another example. This is an Ohio science teacher. His name, as you can see, is John Freshwater. And in April of 2008, after he had been a teacher there for 20 years and the previous year had won the Teacher of the Year award, he was ordered by the school administration to remove his Bible from his desk, and they cited that it was a violation of separation of church and state for him to have a Bible on his desk in the classroom. Now this is where we are. In 2007, Dr. Michael Campion. Campion was previously a professor at the University of Illinois College of Medicine, was there for 18 years. He had then become an employee of the city of Minneapolis, where he did employment testing for people like police officers and firefighters. He was terminated after the city government discovered that he was involved with the Illinois Family Institute, a Christian pro-family group. Lost his job. And these are just examples. These are just simple examples of what is going on in America. Here's another example of how Christianity is being silenced in America through Agenda 21, sustainable development, and rezoning. Now, most of you are aware, I know, that all over the world we have conferences going on where we're talking about how man is a parasite on the planet and how we need to reduce the land that we use and pull everybody into walking communities. And so city after city, even in Oklahoma, Tulsa and Oklahoma City, our largest cities in our state, have aggressive plans to urbanize people and to move them into cities off of the earth so that it can go back to its natural state, because they believe, after all, that we're a parasite. I've often been interested to note that they believe that the earth ought to only have about 1 billion people. It's always interesting to me that those who are making that statement always end up being in that 1 billion. They're not in the other 5 or 6, they're in the 1. Now, what are cities doing to try to literally outlaw churches? Well, here are just a few examples. In Arizona, Gilbert, Arizona, a church called the Oasis of Truth was told by a zoning administrator that Bible studies are not permitted in private homes, and they were given a violation notice. In Avondale Estates in Georgia, the Christ Liberty Family Center was shut down and issued a code violation, get this, because they don't have enough parking space. In that city, a church has to have at least 3 acres to exist. You can't be a church if you don't have at least 3 acres, and you have to have 100 feet of frontage for parking. And so they shut this church down. In Evanston, Illinois, for 6 years, the Vineyard Church has met in a suburb of North Chicago. But the problem is, even though they're able to meet and sing and pray in the building they own, they can't do it on Sundays. Now, here's the reason why. Because their building is located in an office zone where membership association and cultural institutions like theaters and concert halls are allowed, but worship services are not. So here's the irony of this law. If Vineyard Church in this business zone wanted to, for instance, present the play Fiddler on the Roof, which contains a traditional Jewish wedding, they could, but they could not host an actual wedding. I mean, that's the kind of insanity that we're facing. Now, this is a barn. It's a barn in Virginia. This is Garland Simon's barn. A cowboy church has been meeting in Garland Simon's barn, but they were recently told by county officials that they're not going to be able to have services there anymore. Now, this barn is located on a 900-acre farm. They said, well, you can't have services there. They said, why not? It's not zoned for church services. Now, it's kind of interesting that they can host a barn dance. They could do that, but they cannot have a worship service. And so throughout America, you have cities using zoning laws to shut churches down. Here's Denver, Colorado. A church, a lady here was having prayer meetings at her house, and they cited her for excessive prayer meetings. They said, we don't think you ought to have more than 1 a month. In Arapahoe County, Colorado, zoning officials literally limit churches to certain size congregations. St. Petersburg, Florida. Here's a church that was redefined as a social service agency so they could shut them down because they said we can't have social service agencies in this area. Here's another church, Orlando, Florida. The city was informed the church was informed by the city that they were operating illegally because they labeled their church as a home business. Here's one that's kind of interesting. A church in Richmond, Virginia was given a violation because they didn't have a conditional use permit to feed the hungry. Said if you feed the hungry, you have to pay $1,000 to get a permit plus $100 per acre of affected property. The statute goes on to say that there are only 7 days a year that you can actually feed the hungry. You have got to pick 7 days between October the 1st and April the 1st. I mean, it's just insanity. It's insanity. Now that brings me to the last place where I believe Christianity is being silenced in America. It's the church. Out of all the places where Christianity is being silenced, I really believe that's where it's being silenced the most effectively. And you say, well, how do you figure that? Preachers like John Muhlenberg, who literally went off to war and recruited men from his own congregation. Preachers like James Caldwell, a Presbyterian preacher in New Jersey, who literally led his men into war to fight for liberty. You'll hear about Jonas Clark, who actually trained and led the famous Minutemen of Lexington. Most people don't even know they were trained and led by a pastor. But where are our pastors today? You see, our pastors today are hiding behind their pulpits while their congregations literally gag them because somehow they've come to believe that it is illegal, that it is a sin, that it's unconstitutional to mix politics and religion. Something completely foreign from our founders, as we saw at the very beginning of this presentation. In fact, church congregations, and especially their leadership, I believe are silencing their pastors by an incorrect understanding of this phrase, separation of church and state. Now I want to close with this quote. Many of you know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is. He was a Lutheran pastor in Germany during World War II. He eventually gave his life to stand against Hitler and the Nazis. In fact, he was executed just a handful of days before Berlin fell and Hitler committed suicide. Bonhoeffer, before he died, said this about taking a stand. He said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." Friends, if we don't do something quickly, if we do not stand up and speak up, our churches will not only be censored, but the lights will go out. Not only in our churches, but friends, when the lights go out in the church, they'll go out in America. Thank you so much for your time today. God bless you.